All right, good evening and welcome to the second Silent Intelligence meetup this year, focused on the IoT, data privacy, security, and ownership. For those who don't know me, my name is Daniel Obadovsky and I'm the founder of the Silent Intelligence. And to tell you a little bit more about our community, the whole idea is to build the community in San Diego around Internet of Things and do more events. We're going to do a lot more events. And not just events, and the whole idea to bring people together, help them, find the right people in their networks, and do great things together. So today, as mentioned, we're going to talk about the IoT security, privacy, and data ownership. But before I go to the program, I wanted to say thanks to our location sponsor today, to the great company called Outmetrics. Great location. And I would like to ask Lee Jacobson to say a couple of words about his company. Yes, please.
I will.
Wow, what a great turnout. Gosh, I just want to say thanks for everybody to come out. When Dale and I had a talk probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I said, how can we help give back to what we're contributing to on the data side? He said, well, I'm doing these things called Wearable Wednesdays. And I was like, I don't know what the heck that is. I had no idea what that was like a couple of months ago. So I went to the last one, and I thought, what a great way to really bring people together and share ideas and concepts about a number of different things. And I said, I want to be part of it. And so we're fortunate in that, as a startup company, the city has been absolutely terrific to us. I can't even, tell you how great it's been. We've raised, a good amount of seed capital. We're now doing our Series A round. We have great customers, and it's really exciting for us to be a part of dealing with big data and devices and apps and smartphones and all the things in part of San Diego. It's a normal thing in the Bay Area where a lot of my friends and colleagues and Daniels as well are from, but here it's not always such a big thing, at least from what I understood in San Diego. And for you guys all to be here and grow this community and for us to be a part of it now is honestly one of the best things that all of us here who've really worked hard could hope to really have. So, if you guys all grow, I always say this sort of to wrap things up and make it short and sweet, but we are a sort of an analytics company that's focused around devices and social media and sentiment, and we have an enormous amount of flexibility and capability to track a lot of things. We have some really big customers that we can all talk to you about afterwards. But if we can help as you guys grow, help you understand those deep understanding user behaviors and targeted and re-engage and really understand your community and how they grow, we're here to help you do that. And I hope to have many more of these, as we grow as part of the community, and certainly with Daniel. And again, thanks to everybody. We couldn't be happier you're here. Enjoy yourself and have a great night. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lee. By the way, I can see from here at least 4 or 5 or 6 empty chairs. So please, feel free to occupy them. And you don't have to stand the whole time. Talking about security, data privacy, and data ownership. So just sharing with you a little bit of my experience with it. So when we were working on the book, The Silent Intelligence about the Internet of Things, we kind of completely neglected the whole area of privacy, security, and data ownership. We talked about everything except data privacy and data security and data ownership. And then the very, very first keynote that I gave after the book came out was about data privacy, security, and data ownership. I was invited by Darren Anderson by CyberHive to give the very first keynote, and that's what people cared about. That's what everybody wanted to know. And after that, I started being invited over and over and over again to talk about that. So it became very obvious how big of an issue that is, and then I started reading more and more. So today we put this panel and brought all these experts together to try to dissect the whole issue. And to me, all those three things are very closely connected: security, privacy, and data ownership, because one kind of flows from the other. So with this, I wanted to introduce the panel. We have Jason Oberg of Tortuga Logic, who is the CEO, which is a very cool San Diego security startup. We have Shirley Adams, who is a VP with General Dynamics, with specifically, well, I'll let you opportunity to talk a little bit more about this. And Noel Gillespie, who is partner with Procopio, a law firm. So I think from that standpoint, I think we covered all kinds of aspects of technology and everything else. So I want to start with giving each of you about 5 minutes to introduce yourself, and also say a few words about what it means for you, the data security, privacy, and ownership in the Internet of Things.
All right, thanks, Daniel. So I'm, as Daniel said, I'm Jason Ober. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tortuga Logic. I actually did my PhD here at UCSD in hardware security, and Tortuga Logic's a hardware security company. So we started Tortuga Logic because we noticed that there's been a lot of hacks on embedded in, I would say, IoT type devices, like people hacked into pacemakers, cars, baby monitors, and sort of the list continues to grow every day. I open my news and look at it. And so, our goal at, we feel like the best way to solve this problem is really to build security in from the beginning and not have it as an afterthought that you try to tackle purely in software. So we take a hardware approach to solving that problem. We have solutions for making sure the chipsets that are going into these devices are built in a secure way. So I think it's clear. My biggest take on security is that I can't speak about data ownership and these sort of things as well, but we need to really think about security from the very beginning, come up with methods and tools to really ensure that we're building these devices in a secure way rather than just buying components, throwing pieces, running Kickstarter, buying some chipsets, throwing it onto some device and selling it, and being surprised when somebody hacks it and then something happens, right? So we need to try to avoid those sort of problems. And so I think if we follow a path that works to solve that, we can really do it. So.
Hi, I'm Shirley Adams. I'm a vice president with General Dynamics IT. I run a group of professionals that service really all aspects of cybersecurity, from handling personal identification information to being proactive, being reactive, participating in various aspects of cybersecurity, such as if somebody has been hacked, we can assist in going in and doing the forensics to find out why they were hacked. We try to do preventative, we set up networks, we handle communications. One of our biggest contracts that I have under my group is what they call DRSN, which is the Defense Red Switch. So the telephone that you see in the movies where it's the red telephone that the president picks up and nobody knows what they're saying. Those are one of the networks that we support. So various aspects of it. I also serve the Armed Forces Communication Electronics Association here in San Diego and serve as their regional vice president for the Southern California area. So I really am not what I would consider a subject matter expert in IoT. I think that the reason Darren probably recommended me for this is just because of the little bit of exposure that I get, although it's not really deep. I can talk about a lot of different things, and hopefully you can gain from my wisdom, and I'm certainly going to gain from yours because I've already talked to several brainards in this group that made me feel very humble for the fact that I was here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Noel Gillespie. I am a partner with Procopio. We're a full-service San Diego born and raised firm. We're actually the largest firm in San Diego. We have about 140 attorneys here, full service, doing everything. I'm in the IP group. I'm mainly a patent attorney. We have one of the larger patent groups in town. And a lot of the things that we're doing actually get to this issue of kind of privacy and security and data ownership. So I'm actually the head of our MedTech practice groups. One of the areas I work in a lot is kind of digital health, e-health, wireless health, whatever the name du jour is. But a lot of what's happening there is you have devices, right? Distributed devices. We're getting data that's tied to individuals. And there's, people are running down that path and they're getting all this great data. And I always hear them say as part of their pitch for funding, hey, we own the data, right? So we're going to do something interesting with that data down the road. And what they haven't really thought out a lot of times is with ownership comes responsibility, right? So, early on, a lot of people knew to ask the question, well, what about HIPAA, right? There's HIPAA, right? Do I have to worry about that? But beyond even HIPAA, especially in California, there are a lot of privacy rules that kind of parallel HIPAA. So if you have personal identifying information, you have responsibility now. You have duties and obligations if you don't live up to them. You have liability, potentially, right? So we had a lot of people running down that road and not really thinking about it. In that kind of medtech healthcare space, we have one of the largest healthcare groups in Southern California as well, and so we work with them a lot in those areas. But you can see that these kind of wearable devices, these distributed devices, I mean, this is just laying the foundation for kind of this Internet of Things, right? It's going to be a lot of the same issues. And, it makes me think of the NSA issue where we all found out they were tracking your metadata from your phone, and then people were saying, do you realize what they can learn just from having your metadata? It's really identifying. They can know you and everything about you just from that data. Well, with all these devices that we're interacting now, somebody potentially owns that data and it's identifying for you. So if you're a business trying to take advantage of that, you got a lot of things to think about. And we can talk about some of those tonight.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Okay. So you guys can have your own mic. So my question, kind of, I wanted to first ask everybody is, what's different really with IoT, right? I mean, how is it different from any other security issues that we have with, traditional computers and hacking into stealing your email and so on? All of a sudden, with the IoT, you get all this hype about security and privacy issues. So what's the paradigm shift? What's the change? Why do we need to pay special attention?
So I mean, it's at least from a the black hat standpoint. It's the attack space is much different. So with the laptop or desktop paradigm, you have these operating systems that you're looking for bugs in, or looking for some sort of flaw in a web browser or something like that. With an IoT device, you kind of add this, for one, you're adding a whole physical element. You have the ability to directly handle, tinker, and try to figure out ways to get into the device that way. And at the same time, it's there's other connectivity there that wouldn't really exist on a desktop that you would try to exploit using sort of a remote attacks. There's ways that you can connect to the device. I mean, for example, a lot of attacks are done on pacemakers where there's wireless connectivity that existed for the doctors to do debug diagnostics. So they could, they wouldn't have to take the pacemaker out of a patient to figure out if it was still working and these sort of things. And attackers exploited that to show that you could actually, turn it off or, cause a heart attack to the patient. And so that sort of attack vector doesn't really exist in a laptop or a desktop or a server. And so I think the space that the attacks that have come up are going to be much different. A lot of these devices too are, going to be in your pacemaker or wearable or something that's going to be, you might rely on for your personal safety too. So.
Yeah, I think the key there is the word exploitation. There's a lot of developers out there. They've got a great idea, and especially with the way that IoT is running rampant, there's always a reason to develop a sensor or a technology or a piece of software. The list goes on and on and on. And I think that most of these are designed and developed for the purpose of good. Unfortunately, for the purpose of good, there's always those guys out there that are the bad guys, and they're going to use it, to their advantage. So I don't think that sometimes the folks that are actually doing the development to begin with They don't have the malicious side, but yet at the same time, it is more dangerous in many ways because it is life-threatening. You know, say for an example, especially with sensor technology, you know, we have our oil and our gas industry, we have our water supplies. You know, everything we do these days is connected through some sort of software, the internet. The list goes on and on and on. So even by the time you connect some of those dots, you know, again, it may not even start here. It may end up somewhere else. And we don't necessarily think like bad guys, but, you know, for everything that you're doing good for the water supply, okay, what if somebody really doesn't want to do good for the water supply and they want to become the emperor of the world, or, you know, and I hate to sound paranoid, but, you know, unfortunately that is the world that we live in, and we see it happening over and over and over again. And it's much more dangerous because of the world of sensors.
Yeah, I think, you know, the internet things creates two issues, and one of them is maybe not a paradigm shift, but just an extension of kind of the current paradigm. The other one's a paradigm shift. But, you know, we're taking the processing and we're distributing it ever kind of more and further and into everything, right? So we've gone, obviously, from mainframes and servers to PCs and laptops, which was kind of similar. It's just more of the same. It's more finite, it's more distributed, it's more ubiquitous. And I think the real paradigm shift now is the amount of data and the type of data that we're able to get and the value you can really derive from that. And so you have all these distributed computers, basically, that have data that can be valuable, and, you know, they can be easy to attack because of wireless and these different things. So that's the real paradigm shift, is just how much data we're able to get now, because it's just processing so ubiquitous now, you know.
Thanks. So I have a question for you, Jason, about, so you're a hardware security company that goes all the way to the silicon, right? So why is it so important to have a hardware security company versus just having, you know, security on the application layer?
So it kind of goes back to what I was saying, that you know, the goal here would be to build security from the very beginning. So a lot of the issues that you actually get, a lot of security issues you actually get can actually be solved directly with software. So I mean, you can think about, there's a lot of physical-based attacks that, for one, that you can't solve with software. So you know, you can actually measure how much. If you're running a data encryption algorithm, you can actually measure how much power your chip's consuming and extract the full encryption key. So there's a whole company around that does you know, licenses technologies to try to eliminate that. And so there's you know, when you get down into the hardware, if there's a bug, or if it was designed poorly, a lot of times you can't fix that with you know, your operating system security is just not going to target that. You know, you might be able to resolve it with some firmware, but that's not going to be able to be fixed by you know, that has some other issues in terms of updating that and everything. But you know, the goal is, if you make sure that both the hardware and the firmware and that interaction is built in a secure way, you can really prevent a lot of a bigger attack, especially in the IoT, when they're not going to be running, you know, much larger operating systems and these sort of things too. So they might mean in the IoT, they might just be hardware, some low-level software. If you don't have the interaction tightly monitored and built in the correct way, then you're going to have some problems.
So my next question is to you, Shirley. Noel earlier mentioned huge amounts of data, but sometimes it feels like from all the wearable devices and all connected devices, there's a lot of meaningless data, actually, if somebody would hack at it. So what are the drivers for somebody to go and try and steal all this data and get access to this data?
Well, typically drivers center around either money or power. So depending on what your end objective is, whether it's driven by money because you want to be the best tomato grower. We were in a conversation earlier today, we were talking about some of the technologies that are out there for agriculture. You want to be the best tomato grower, so you want to put all other tomato growers out of business. So therefore, you're going to buy data that you would think would probably be harmless. But if you're a manufacturer of a UAV that goes out and collects and stores surveillance data on, you know, a particular type of crop, and you're going to develop the most sound environment for, you know, this crop of tomatoes. So you're going to want to use the least amount of investment to get a return on your investment. But then you look at the repercussions of that. So again, then you've got the next guy who not only wants to grow the best tomatoes, but he actually wants to grow poisonous tomatoes so that he can poison your food supply. Well, there's another different driver. So same scenario, but one is after money, the other one is after power. And you can apply those drivers to just about anything. Insurance companies today are very interested in big data and collecting information to see if you're, we talked about the issue with the toilets, right? I'm sure you've probably all read in the newspapers lately where the smart toilets, Internet of Things, when you flush that information down the drain, there's a lot of information that goes along with it. So insurance companies want smart toilets designed and developed, and they've already done it, right? That will analyze, you know, your morning constitutional and report back to your insurance company whether or not you're taking drugs, whether you're eating healthy, what you had for breakfast, you know. So you talk about privacy and what drives it. Well, if they want to increase your insurance premiums because you're not a healthy person or you don't practice a healthy lifestyle, you know, there's money. But again, there's probably another reason why somebody might want that data so they can use it against you. So I think it boils down to money or power, one of the two.
Thanks. Noel, let's say I have a company that makes wearable devices, and I end up collecting a lot of data and I want to monetize that data. What do I need to keep in mind? Can I go about it from a legal standpoint? What can I do, what I cannot do, and what's the best way to move forward?
Yeah, so the first question is the ownership, and like I said, we get a lot of companies saying, well, we're going to own the data. So the first thing you have to do is make sure you're actually in a situation where you own the data, right? That your user agreements or your contracts, whatever you're doing, express that you are going to be the one that owns the data, you own the data. The problem is, especially with like a wearable device that's getting, you know, information about an individual and the things that they're doing, well, now all of a sudden, you know, these privacy laws apply to you, right? And therefore you have to have security in place to make sure that that data, that PII, is not something that can be compromised, breached, is sent to the wrong place, used in the wrong way. And so you have to be planning for these, right? So now all of a sudden you have a security obligation. What can you do with that data? Is it something that's regulated? And if you haven't put all of these things into kind of your business plan and what you're going to be able to do, you can get pretty far down the line, and all of a sudden your investor or somebody that wants to acquire your company is poking around and asking these questions and realizes, hey, you don't have a plan for the security of it, or your contracts don't ensure that you own that data, or even though you own it, you can't do the things that you wanted to do with it as part of your business plan. So it's important early on to be looking at all of those things and make sure you're okay. And it's, you know, it can be difficult, like in the healthcare arena, again, where I have a lot of doctors who have started businesses, they understand HIPAA in theory, and they're getting data from wearable devices, and they've got some waiver, you know, that they hand out. Everybody waives, you know, this HIPAA, you know, it's okay, I can use your data, I can share your data. Well, we look at those agreements, and these are doctors, and we're saying, you can't waive, it's not waivable. Like, it's a law, it's an obligation on you. They can't waive it in this way. You know, so those are doctors who are, you know, familiar, at least in that context, and they get it wrong. So it's something you really have to be thinking about, all three, right? Do I own it? So then what privacy obligations now am I under? And what kind of security do I have to have? They are very linked, as Daniel said early on.
So I have a follow-up question. Now, what's, in your opinion, the status of the regulation and data privacy and data ownership? Do you feel like there's more needs to happen, or is the framework kind of coming together?
So it is kind of coming from two different areas. So when a lot of this is healthcare data, you know, it's wearables like that, and so HIPAA can potentially apply, and where it doesn't, they're trying to backfill and say, hey, we need some privacy regulation that kind of mirrors that for somebody that's not a covered entity. So HIPAA only applies if you're a covered entity or a business associate. Covered entities are insurers, hospitals, doctors, basically business associates. are people like us who work with them and then get that healthcare information from them. So that's the only time HIPAA applies. So if you've built, a Fitbit and you're getting information, you're not a covered entity, but you have potentially PII, personal identification information. And so there's a kind of parallel or mirror regulation. So in that field, I think we're doing okay, especially in California. Then there's the security side of it, and HIPAA and these things definitely have a security side to it, but a lot of that was driven more from banking, right, where I've got your social security number and your bank account number, and there's a real security is very heavy there. But it's starting to branch out, this idea of security, and hey, we need to apply it to more than just banking information. But I don't think, how and when and why from the security side is as well defined, and it's a little scattershot. I mean, I had a client, a board member, come in of a client and say, hey, what do you guys do for security? Because I'm on the board and I'm getting asked these questions, and I'm thinking, I'm just your lawyer, I don't, I'm not a security company, why are you asking me, but it's because they don't know. They know there's pressure, but there's not clear guidelines as you kind of get out of that banking environment on that side.
So I wanted just to continue on the topic of PII and ask Shirley, what's your view on the PII, what companies need to be aware of?
Well, I think that is an area where education really comes into play because, for an example, with my company, we are regulated by the government, and there's what they call a federal acquisition requirement, and there's rules and regulations that says if you're a company or an individual that handles PII, then you are obligated and required to adhere to certain security measures, and if you don't, you can be heavily fined for it. So I think that from an educational standpoint, and that's one of the reasons why we have forums like this, is to let entrepreneurs know that, hey, this goes a lot deeper, and really make certain that you're checking into the laws and what those regulations are and what the requirements of those laws are, because, unfortunately, you can't hold up your hand and say, gee, I didn't know. And like I said, you can be fined heavily. You can also be imprisoned for it. So the penalties can get pretty harsh. So it's something that you definitely need to become aware of. There's websites available. In fact, right prior to this, I actually printed out one of the FARs so that with regard to PII information, I have that website if anybody would like me to share it with you afterwards.
Super, thanks. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit back to the security. And as we all know, the IoT market is very fragmented. We have all kinds of devices, we have different types of silicon and whatnot. So how do you bridge all this fragmentation with security, and what do you think needs to happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I said, our focus is primarily on the beginning pieces of this, but I mean, there's already movements to help try to solve some of these problems. This company called Lab Mouse Security, it's run by Don Bailey, who they're trying to put together essentially a stack for building a secure IoT device. So they're missing everything essentially, everything but the hardware, which we could provide. But the idea there is they have firmware, applications, and then sort of the whole stack and how that can get built in a way that is in a secure way. And then actually ARM has a similar program that they're trying to put together called Embed. And so there's movement towards this. I would say it's going in the right track. But I mean, we're going to need some sort of standardization between. I wouldn't want to say government. Whenever I say standardization, people think that we need regulation on it. But I think there needs to be partnerships with different stakeholders, and people that are building chipsets to building the boards to building the application layers and everything else that need to interact to make sure that everything is communicating in a secure way, and that those are, if you just start having people run Kickstarters, buying chipsets, building boards, throwing Android on whatever, seeing, oh, here's my device, then we're going to have a lot of problems. But if there's an interaction between those different layers, then I think we can help solve that problem.
So just following on this theme, right? So in the smartphone world, we kind of perceive iOS as more secure than Android. now, when we go into the IoT space, you have like Android Wear, you have like and many different platforms. So do you feel like something is already emerging as more secure and versus other things? Do you see any leaders emerging in the space?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think like I said, the ARM embed and LabMouse, both those guys are on the right track. But in terms of the reason that people have to think the perception that like an iOS type of model is more secure is because they build everything in house, so they're naturally kind of following that model. Whereas an Android based one is they're building this separate. You buy that as an afterthought, and then the actual hardware is fragmented across everything. So not to say that iOS is secure and that Apple's products are secure because they have their own set of problems, but I think definitely if there's a big fragmentation and there's not cross communication between the different stakeholders in these devices, then we're going to run into problems. But speak on specifics of, I don't think there's one company out there that's doing it right. I think it's going to require a bunch of people to work together.
Thanks. Shirley, I was going to ask you about, you deal a lot with the government, with the DoD and highly secure environments. Do you feel like there are any best practices that the rest of the industry could apply from those spaces and kind of learn from when it comes to security and IoT?
Oh, that's a good question. Because working with the Department of Defense, there are so many different legacy systems out there and so many different customers that even though there are so-called standards, there's no real standards because there's so many standards. And I know that probably doesn't make sense, but we run into it every day. We're constantly looking out into the commercial market for good ideas. I think it's a collaborative thing. I think that there are things to be learned from the government space. I think that the majority of it is kept secret for probably way too long. And so by the time they actually let it out, somebody else has created something better. But that street goes both ways, I'd have to say. Unfortunately, I can't talk too much about the stuff that does go on in the government, but I would have to say that we learn from industry as much as industry learns from government.
Thanks. Next question to Noel. There are a lot of been discussed in the press and so on, some really paranoid scenarios. If, for example, in the corporation, a corporation gives us all a fitness monitoring device, and they get access to our fitness habits, and can they use this data potentially against us? So what's the legal framework? Can they actually do that if they give us the devices, or what, is this a completely paranoid scenario? Can this really happen in real life?
Is it completely paranoid that a company would want to do that, or
can they legally do that?
No, I don't think you can actually. Most of those programs, just the framework is for that reason. The insurance company doesn't say to the individual, "Hey, I'll lower something," with respect to your insurance. They say to the company, "Hey, we'll give you whatever, 10% off, 5% off if." You have some kind of wellness programs in place. And 90% of the time what that means is they offer free gym memberships to everybody. People sign up, nobody uses them, and the company gets 5% off or whatever. Now, so it's interesting because these devices really give you an opportunity to do something more, and since we're still in an era where companies are the largest kind of providers for insurance, you would think that, kind of makes sense, right? To be able to go in and say, look, let's do something meaningful. I want to know if you're going to the gym. Something that maybe just tracks your cell phone at least, so I know you're there or when you're there, right? But you can't. The discrimination suits, what would come back would at least today, can't do that stuff legally.
Well, that's good to know.
So you guys don't have to go to the gym.
Just don't buy a smart toilet.
I didn't know there were smart toilets, to be honest, but I learned something new today. I have actually a question to all of you, which is, there have been a lot of discussion about the smart retail And so smart retail, which is basically when they track you inside of a retail space using either your watch or eye beacons or whatnot. They potentially use like cameras that track your eye movements, and so that raises, at least for some people, raises privacy concerns, right? So how much we as consumers, how much, I don't know, power of how much control do we have of what retailers, what data can they get from us, and what can we do about this? Whoever wants to start.
Well, just from a legal standpoint, I mean, I have concerns about that too. So, and the problem is, okay, let's say you're doing it, you're walking by, I know where your phone is, maybe I track your eye movement, I see you're looking at this store, not that store, so I push a coupon or an ad to you. Maybe okay. If I store all that data now, I have no agreement with you, I mean, at least in my hypothetical, right, that says I have the right to get that data, I have the right to keep that data, I have the right to sell that data. And so if you were doing that kind of things without some kind of opt-in, then I think you'd have some legal problems. I don't know so much just in the moment, you know, tracking it temporarily, saying, okay, they're looking at the Jamba Juice, they're starting to walk away, give them a, you know, 50% off or, you know, 50 cents off or something. Probably okay. It's the storing it and then without that agreement in place that says you can, that creates issues in my mind.
I think part of the problem there is the benefit. Is anybody really going to complain or attempt to sue anybody, and is there a masses large enough to drive that change? It's kind of like an initiative that a few years ago they tried to get, you know, everybody stop buying China, you know, because you know, they're not treating us right, and so therefore we're going to stop buying anything that's made in China. Well, at the same time, the consumer, I mean, we want things cheaper, right? We want to buy something, and if it's not that important to us where it's made, we're going to go buy it at Target rather than buying it at Nordstrom, right? So a lot of that, I think, depends on really the driver behind that, and are there going to be enough people that stand up to say, okay, I don't want you, excuse me, tracking me when I'm standing in front of the Pampers aisle and determining whether I buy Pampers or whether I buy Huggies, or using my card when I go through the cash register so that you can track to see whatever it is that I buy. Is that important enough to me to stand up and say, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore? And I don't think there's enough of us in the public spectrum that's really going to take it to a lawsuit, so they get away with it.
Yeah, so I was just going to say on that, the sort of retail space idea, you know, if it was something that they were actually mining data from my phone and that wasn't approved, I'm just thinking on behalf of me being uncomfortable and not from a legal standpoint, but if there was, you know, somehow they were able to you know, they had worked a deal with Apple and they had something that was built into the phone that would send my location data to them, and I wasn't aware of that, that would be, you know, make me uncomfortable. But if it's, you know, I think maybe it's an educational thing, that some people aren't aware of this, but, you know, if you download the Walmart app and you go into Walmart, and in the, you know, agreement it says that we can track where you're going, and then you are walking around Walmart and the app's running, and then you complain about it later. I feel like that's, you know, you should be aware of these sort of things, and I think that's it goes back to sort of, you know, if those things start becoming more prominent, I don't think they're going to be able to just, you know, like Noel said, they can't just take your data and hold it. There's going to be something that you're going to have to, you know, approve, and if it's, you know, there's obviously ways that that's not in the past, and you know, lately those agreements aren't necessarily clear, but like about who owns the data and these sort of things. But I think making sure that people are aware of what they're downloading and what they're signing up to, I think is going to be pretty important.
Can I add something real quick here?
Please.
I think a lot of it too is that, you know, we don't know what we don't know. So do we really know what kind of sensor is in our phone? And do we really know what kind of data is being tracked? So until you become educated with this, you don't even know whether to complain or not. You mentioned Fitbit earlier. A few months ago, my daughter talked me into, you know, hey mom, get this Fitbit thing, you know, it's like the new deal, and you're hiking, and you want to stay in shape, and, you know, on and on. I said, well, you know, I don't know if I really want to do that or not, but she gives me one for Christmas. So I said, what the heck, you know, I'll start wearing it. So a couple of weeks go by, and she said, well, you know, Mom, Apple has an application for your Fitbit. So if you want to, you know, just track it on your phone, because you're always carrying your phone, you don't have to worry about clipping the Fitbit on you all the time. So I thought, well, what the heck, I'll just go in and download the application. Well, the minute I downloaded that application, it already knew for the last 2 months exactly where I had been hiking, when my heart rate was up, when it was down, all of these, you know, health indicators that I had no idea that my phone had been tracking that the whole time. So who needed to buy a $50 Fitbit? You know, it was already there. But again, I didn't know that my phone was tracking all that information, and yet it was all there, and the history was there prior to me ever even downloading it. So again, I think it's just that we don't know what we don't know.
I just want to say something quick that what Jason and Shirley brought up. So that's right. So a lot of times where you get the nobody wants to. So when I say you don't have an agreement that says you own the data, where it is a lot of times is, you know, you download that app, there's a 50-page thing that you read the first sentence of, and then you click OK.
Let me turn it back on.
Thank you. Those are those can be binding agreements, but there is a recognition that none of us read those things, right? So to some extent, it's odd. You know, sometimes a court will say, "Well, you should have," right? It was there. You're an adult. You didn't read it. You said okay. But if enough people, to Shirley's point, are saying, "Hey, look, this is wrong. We didn't read it. We didn't know," it can go the other way, right? Because they're saying, "Well, I mean, who's going to say no? You know, they didn't know what you were going to do. Nobody's really reading it. Did you really spell out what was in there?" So it can go both ways. And to Shirley's point, I mean, if there's kind of a mass of people, that critical mass that's really upset about it, you probably can kind of get those policies overturned. But that's where they get the right to do what they want with your data, is in those things. So you should read them. Actually, I don't either, but you should.
Thanks. All right, at this stage, I wanted to open it up to the audience and for your questions. All right. Actually, yeah.
That one doesn't work, but you passed it.
Somebody will turn it back on for me. So when 40, 50 years ago, if you went into the store and wanted to buy something with cash, right? What would have happened if the cashier said, wait a minute, I got to write down your name here on this dollar because we're tracking everybody's dollar supplies in here. I mean, the revolt would have been immediate, right? It would have been too cumbersome, but the revolt would have been immediate if they said, well, why do you want my data? They would have said data. Why do you want that information, right? So it's a cultural thing, in effect, to what Shirley's talking about to a certain extent. Not so much that we don't revolt, is we're so accepting to things that 40, 50 years ago wouldn't have been. So there's a cultural aspect to all this, as well as getting things down at the hardware layer. A lot of people aren't going to understand what that means, right? A lot of people don't even understand what we have today. So these are all good ideas. I'm not negating them. I'm saying there's the sociological aspect to these things that are quite impelling as well.
And what is the question?
Why are we so accepting? And I don't think we can answer that tonight.
Any thoughts?
How we think about it.
All right.
That's a $1 million question.
Do you guys want to comment on that? Or?
I do think that creep is interesting. You know, it's each one of these things. You know, we go from mainframes to computers to laptops. This thing, there's this creep that we just, it creeps up on you, and you're like, oh, okay. You know, like we don't really think about it. It's true, but it does create issues. You know, so.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, to fall into that, I mean, I think it's something that, you know, it started off, you know, like, oh, look, I can post a picture on the internet, this is kind of cool, and then you start posting other stuff, and then, you know, time goes by and you realize, like, wait, all of that is owned by Facebook now. That's weird. I didn't realize that for the last, 10 years or something. So I think that's, I honestly think that it didn't something like writing on a dollar bill, I think would be very explicit, like this is, I'm taking this. If, when you first posted a picture, if they give you like a pop-up saying this is mine now, you probably would have been more skeptical, but.
I was going to say too, how many in the room can remember their parents or their grandparents saying, don't do that, what are the neighbors going to think? And it was like, oh, we can't do anything, the neighbors might think ill of us. Whereas now the culture is, I could care less what the neighbors think. So there's a lot of that going on too.
All right.
Hey, yeah, this is a hardware question and security. Just in the past week and a half or so, there was a hard drive firmware hack that was exposed, and I was just wondering if there's anything that you could share as far as, like, is there any collaboration between Jason, your company, and others at detecting that at the firmware level, because it's a firmware hack and it's before OS loads and all that? And
yeah, so I think that's so to reiterate, so there's basically, it was and correct me if I'm wrong, so that attack was essentially you can't there was basically a way to prevent a hard drive that was wiped from actually getting wiped, because the firmware itself would store where the blocks were, basically remember where on disk the data was, and then you could read it out using that firmware. And you can't actually, these devices are built, by a separate company. They don't want Microsoft who's running Windows to be able to read that firmware out, because they own it. Seagate owns that, not Microsoft. So anyway, so that's sort of the problems that we're trying to address. So make sure that. So actually, in that case, it was an intentional placement by the NSA that they put that in there. So that was actually collaborated with the hard drive company. But in general, those type of vulnerabilities that are firmware with hardware that might have been either maybe there was somebody in house that was malicious, which is less likely than actually just having a poor design practices that leaves some security holes. So that's the target that exactly what we're looking at. We're trying to make sure that the firmware interacting with the hardware, you're selling a chipset, making sure that is meeting this internal security requirements you have to make sure that you're not going to get something exploited. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so you are working on detect
similar things. Yeah, I would say that particular vulnerability was the people that developed that knew it was there. So it wasn't, to them it wasn't a vulnerability, it was a feature that they wanted to leave in so that wiped hard drives wouldn't actually be wiped. So I would say that
those were all, or any hard drive, so they could get a constant stream of data.
Yeah, I think it was, I can't remember the exact details, but it was basically a way of, for them making sure that when people thought they wiped out, they cleared the whole hard drive. If there was data still, they could still access the data. It's probably to prevent, people that were trying to hide secret files, and government would take their computers and then they could just read all the data out. So.
Super. Yes, please.
I get the impression that the connectivity of the Internet of Things is going to be pretty much Wi-Fi. You buy a device, a refrigerator, washer, whatever, the simplest way for it to connect to everything else is going to be going through the Wi-Fi in your house. Do you foresee some sort of a hardware or software consumer product that can be added on that gets in between the device and your Wi-Fi connection so that people will have some security? Is that realistic?
Yeah, so I think the Wi-Fi example is really a good one, because you're basically what you're doing. You have 20 IoT devices and they're all running on the same network in your house. Maybe there's one that in your toaster and was slapped together from a Kickstarter, and I go and I break into your house and I tinker with your toaster, and I have access to all your internal network, and then I can just go and download all your files from your laptop because it's running on the same Wi-Fi network. So I think that's definitely a big concern. I don't think so much because the protocols between Wi-Fi and these sort of things are good, but if you can exploit one device in that network and it's all the same, then you're going to be able to look at a lot of different things. But on top of that, I think there's other connectivity beyond Wi-Fi. I mean, people hacked into cars with the OnStar system. I mean, that was a different exploit. The pacemaker one I mentioned was another one. So I think there's going to be, as these get more connected, there's probably going to be ways for devices to talk very quickly between each other. Either maybe Bluetooth, it might be something else. And so I think as these protocols and these different mechanisms develop, if we don't think about security as we're developing them, then it's going to be a problem.
Any other comments from you guys? No? All right. Next question.
I had a question for Noel. So, like it came out in the last week that Apple had done some research on various wearables, and it turned out that they weren't very accurate in detecting data for pulse and temperature and various things. So, do we as the public have any kind of recourse? Let's say an insurance company had tracked that data, had tracked my data, let's say, and decided I had hypertension and they didn't want to cover me. Do we have a recourse for that?
Yeah, in that case, absolutely. I mean, if if Apple had made a claim to you as a consumer to that insurance company saying, we're able to provide something accurate, you relied on it, the insurance company relies on it, and then it turns out that's wrong, yeah, that would be a potential cause of action if you're damaged and there's some damage there. It's an interesting question though. So, but in general, just the fact that like they said, oh, this stuff, is accurate and you can rely on it, it turns out not to be. I'm not sure what the damage is. I mean, you're going to go and say, well, yeah, I thought I was getting my heart rate up and losing all this weight, but I really wasn't. It's your fault, So in general, I would say no. But in a scenario, yeah, where they, somebody says, well, I'm going to rely on this to do something, you're damaged, there could be some potential liability there.
So a question for Noel. So earlier when we were talking about smart retail, you kind of brought up the element of time, and I think that's kind of interesting. So if a store, Jamba Juice, sees your faces looking away, you may give you a coupon, that's fine. Now, what if 10 minutes later they do something else with that data, but then half an hour later that data's gone? So where does the line get drawn?
Yeah, it's interesting, and some of it is this idea of who's going to complain, right? So they, in my hypothetical, what's not there is why are you getting ads or coupons in the first place? You probably signed up for something, and you probably signed away the right to complain that they're tracking. But let's say you didn't, right? And it is just kind of spontaneous. There'd be no hard line there. I mean, what I'd be worried more, if I'm still kind of moving around the mall, let's say, and they're kind of continuing to build on that, but I leave the mall and then they, that record's deleted. Much more okay than I'm storing that, next time you show up, I'm building on it, I continue to store it, I'm selling it to malls and other places, so there's soon, that, without a contract in place saying, hey, I'm getting this data, I'm using this data, you're giving me permission to do that, it would be problematic. But something even when you're just walking around there could be too. I mean, if somebody complains, who gave you the right to take that data, right? You didn't have it because you didn't have that agreement in place in that hypothetical. And that's, if you're kind of building businesses around, use of these data, you have to think of these things like, when am I getting the data? Do I have the right to data? Who owns the data? And if you want it to be you, be sure you're setting it up so that it's clear it is you, even though nobody's going to read your little drop-down thing. But be sure you spell it out correctly that says, click here and I own it. So.
I actually have a question for you on that. What about crowdsourcing type data? I know that a lot of the retailers will use crowdsourcing data, which, for an example, the consumer hasn't given them permission to really use the data, but yet they are selling the data so that a particular brand company may be interested in knowing. The scenario I used earlier is how many people did stop by the Huggies booth rather than, and how much time did they spend there so that I know better how to market my product. What about those types of data?
Yeah, anyway, so I guess there could be two things. There could be kind of a passive crowdsourcing and an active crowdsourcing. So just somehow being able to track, this interest level, who's interested in what. So, and there's a parallel again to kind of this HIPAA and this healthcare area. So if there's no identifier, right? So the health data itself with no identifier that's not the healthcare data that's governed by HIPAA. So if it's just, female, 3 kids, likes Huggies, that's not okay. That's probably okay. And you can do some kind of passive crowdsourcing that's just anonymous, basically. It's just giving you straight demographics. Active crowdsourcing is usually there's some kind of, understanding agreement in place that says, here's what we're doing, here's the information we want, kind of help us out with this idea. And you probably got an agreement in place there. So.
All right, so there was some other questions, right?
Yeah. Thanks. So I have two questions. One for everyone and one specifically for Jason. So the everyone question is, outside of the initial handshake, most of the data that's going to come across true IoT things is only going to be useful in the aggregate, right? So does that mean that there have to be a new model of hacking, like, multiple hacking, networked hacking things together? Because, knowing what went down a couple people's toilets is not going to be useful to anyone. So that's the question for everyone. And then the question for Jason is, you mentioned at the start that every week you're getting reports of these kinds of attacks. And I was wondering, are those exploits that are done for demonstration purposes, or are these actual malicious things, particularly as you mentioned, like with pacemakers and things like that? So.
Should we answer the first part first? So to answer the first question in terms of the aggregate idea, so I think in terms of the data sort of privacy issue, and getting nobody's going to want to know what I flushed down the toilet. Probably, I would hope not. Just me. That would be kind of weird. But I think from as I kind of mentioned when we brought up this sort of Wi-Fi, IoT in your house, I think there's a lot of things you can do by exploiting one device on a network that can be potentially very harmful. Rather than, I think it's less interesting to steal the data from what your toaster's doing, because you probably don't care, but you might care a lot if somebody can find that weak link in a weak device in that network and then use that to exploit something that's connected there that's more critical. I guess, should I answer that? I guess I can answer the second part now while I'm like, so to answer the second question, so yeah, the pacemaker example and the automobile were both done in a lab setting. So they were done by researchers. The baby monitor examples was not. That was done by some creep in Texas who started saying lewd things to a 2-year-old kid or something like that. It was really weird. I just saw this morning there was this promotion by McDonald's where they gave out free MP3 players in Japan for probably one of their Monopoly kind of games, and those were filled with a bunch of Trojans. People would plug the MP3 player into their laptop and it would load a bunch of malware into their computer. And then there's a lot of other issues with actual hardware issues where there's concern about people placing circuitry. Pretty much all of our chips, except the ones that are developed by Intel, are fabricated overseas, and so there's big concern that they're going to throw circuitry in there that'll come back with have kill switches and these sort of things. And there's been documented cases where that has things like that have happened. So.
I think in answer to your all question, it's a combination of things, and a lot of it depends on what the driver is. Is it somebody who wants to go steal, $5 out of everybody in the world's bank account? Well, that might be something that, again, they get the vulnerability and they can hack into somebody's computer and get their bank account, steal just enough to where you're never going to notice the difference. Or you may be a person of interest. Maybe you've got something that somebody else wants to know. Maybe it's, the government wanting to know whether or not you're selling secrets to, some foreign country or whatever. So again, I think it's really dependent upon what the driver is behind why somebody wants to get into your data and what is it that they want to find.
Yeah, I mean, my own view is that it is in the aggregate, but networks like a Wi-Fi network in your house make that vulnerable, right? So all of your refrigerator, your toaster, everything is talking through that Wi-Fi. If you've got Fitbits, your phone's talking through it, you have all this data in your phone you didn't even know was there, and it's all connecting to that Wi-Fi. And so if you can, you know, take advantage of a vulnerability and get all this data in an aggregate. I mean, it really does remind me of kind of that NSA, you know, metadata in your phone and how much they could know about you just from that. Well, if I aggregate all that data, you know, when you're going to the fridge, what are you getting out of the fridge? When are you going to the bathroom? When are you doing this? When are you doing that? What's your heart? You know, I have all this data about you in the aggregate, but I can get it through one device potentially. Yeah, that can be very powerful, you know, if I'm able to exploit that and do that.
You're trying to follow on question that to trigger a thought. You mentioned the NSA, but also Google. You know,
they're worse.
Yeah. Most people think of Google as a search engine, but you ask them, they'll tell you they're a data collection company. What about them? I mean, they're holding data, and in a lot of cases for years. And I mean, we're talking since they started collecting data. So where do they fall in all this, and what's their
sounds like a class action suit to me. Well, I mean, and I don't know enough about that one in particular. Again, if it's kind of anonymized, right? I kind of know what's being searched, when it's being searched, geographic. You know, there's a lot of things I can have that's anonymized. It's not tied to me personally.
Except for NSA.
NSA, yeah. But if Google, you know, if they are tracking it to you as an individual, that does create a legal, I mean, you know, there better be a contract in place that says they have the right to do that.
All right, so we probably have time for the last question, so let's go with the last question. And
so big data is an interesting topic, right? You can collect a lot of data, but how does that get analyzed? And I think there's many of us don't know how that information gets analyzed. What are the structures that are analyzing this? And I'll give you a little tidbit on big data, a little bit that I know. A number of years ago, it was about 4 terabytes of log data a day were being collected by a certain firm. And in order to analyze that every day, which they needed to do for advertising purposes, this had to be spread out across thousands of disks, thousands of controllers, so that each part of a disk was dedicated to a certain piece of data. So that when they wanted to analyze it, they could go right to those spots on disk. They didn't have to hunt through the disk to find it. Well, I'm talking about years ago. Now that's multiples of those numbers. And this data is collected. Talked about Google, talked about adding the data as an aggregate. So the things that we're talking about tonight are somewhat scary, because they can do statistical analysis on these things that applies to groups. And most of us aren't that different in many ways. We're unique, but health information, heart pumping, blood pressure, there's a lot of similarities in us. And so that analysis can be quite important to people who want to use it to help us, as Shirley was saying, and those who want to harm us. There's not necessarily
and the question,
paranoid over it, you just need to be aware of it.
And the question is?
Why are we so permissive?
All right, okay. So,
the question is, why don't you just go to my Facebook page? It's all there.
All right, last, very, very last question. Anybody has a last question? A question, not a comment?
I have a question.
All right.
Can you guys comment on privacy laws? Because they vary country by country. And at CyberFest last fall, they clearly said if you're developing products, we should follow Canadian privacy laws, because the U.S. laws are fairly weak. But I always hear about what do we ask developers legally obligated to do with privacy, and are there really laws in the United States?
Yeah, I would say it changes by state too, depending on the kind of data. Yeah, I mean you better know where your device is going and what law you're going to have to come under. I mean, there is no universal, you know, global standard, right? So somebody may be saying, well, we should all design in Canada. That's a good one, and that may be sufficient then to make sure you meet it in the U.S. But you've got to look jurisdiction by jurisdiction and make sure you're complying with it, whatever the laws are there. But yeah, there is no uniform, even state by state, on those things, what I would say.
Yeah, actually, I don't know what more really we could say other than it's pretty generic. I think a big thing is just, again, education, you know, and it starts in the schools. I mean, I participated in securing our e-city for a while, and we had, you know, we had about 11 different aspects of that, and really every piece of it really was begins and stops with education and understanding, you know, what it is that we're getting ourselves into. And you know, kids, 2-year-olds are using computers these days, you know, for one thing or another. So it's not just protecting and, you know, making sure that something is private, but also why is it private and how do I maintain that privacy? And again, the culture thing too. Is it even important that it's private? I mean, you know, look at Facebook and Instagram. I talk to my grandkids all the time about, you know, you shouldn't do that because people can use, oh, you know, you're just being paranoid. Well, you know, I'm sorry, but, you know, there is a lot of truth to that too.
I can't really comment on the legality of the privacy issues. I would talk to Noel. That'd be my recommendation.
We need
All right.
more attorneys.
Well, here I wanted to thank the panelists for their contribution and for the great, everybody for the great questions. Please, if you haven't, please join our meetup, the Silent Intelligence San Diego, for more exciting events. Please follow us on Twitter, Silent Intel Book, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at other events that are going to be coming up. Thanks a lot for coming.